Well, we'll just have to pretend that we're in the ballroom today because we're in a different setting. And last year we were unable to have this conversation because it was just been 1 year ago this month that both organizations had to make the decision that we were not having our conference in light of the pandemic. So a lot has happened in that last year, and we're going to, during this conversation, maybe unpack a little bit of that and talk about how things went, but also talk about looking toward the future. And both organizations, NASBE and CCSSO, play a critical role in the governing the education system in this country. And we work with lots of partners. Both of us work with state legislators, we work with Congress, we work with the governors, we work with just a host of organizations. However, I would say that these two organizations are probably the most important relationship with each other because state boards and state chiefs are intricately connected by nature of their jobs. And in order to move forward a state education agenda, it takes both the state chief and the state board working, syncing together every single step of the way. And that's what we hope our organizations are doing, is are mirroring that and helping that to happen across the country. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce my counterpart, the leader at CCSSO, Carissa Moffett-Miller, who is our colleague, our friend, and our partner. And so we welcome you to the table and would like to let you make some comments and then introduce the chair of your board, and then I'll do the same.
Absolutely. Thank you, Robert, for inviting me to be here. And I'm just, I was thinking back even to last March, we kind of did a redux because it's been a year. We had to make the difficult decision to not host each of our conferences last year. And I remember thinking at that point, is this the right decision? Is it just going to be a few weeks? And, little did we know where we are today. But I think we've learned a lot in that year, and it gives us an opportunity to look forward to what we may have had preconceived notions about that we couldn't set aside, that we actually can go forward on. So I look forward to having this conversation. I think it'll be a robust one of like how much work has been done over this past year and what we together as organizations and as leaders of state education systems can actually do for kids and increase equity for kids. So I will introduce my board chair, the Commissioner of Education in Nebraska, Matt Bloomstead. And I'll let you take it from there, Robert.
We appreciate you being here, and Matt, thanks for sharing with our members. Of course, you're not a stranger to our members. We've seen you before, and we work with you regularly. So we just welcome you to the conversation today. And then I'll just introduce the chairman of our board, and then we'll begin the conversation in earnest. Let's play on words there, in earnest, because the chairman of our board is Dr. Byron Earnest from the state of Indiana. Byron has been on the state board in Indiana for some time. He has served NASBE well in various, he's been the past secretary treasurer, and now is the chairman of our board through October. So Byron, welcome to the conversation, and glad that you could join us today. So. Well, I'm going to throw out the first question for both Matt and Byron to respond to. And we'd like to begin by having you just to share the current context, the current state of play in your state with learning, where we are in the learning process, remote, in-person, hybrid. And given where your state is, could you share with us what your current priorities are in terms of accelerated learning, in terms of how we're moving toward summer or fall? Just give us a state of play of where you are in your state, and then what some of your current priorities are. And then we can delve into some particular issues maybe that you bring up. So let's let our guest, Matt, go first here.
Yeah, and thank you, Robert. And really thanks to NASBE, always the partnership. I know all of our board members participate and appreciate everything that NASBE does, and I do too. So, and by the way, I would be remiss in saying I don't appreciate all my board members too, because I, like a few of us state chiefs, work directly for our state board, and I'm really proud of that relationship that we have and that partnership that we have. So I will say, I mean, we're providing this at a moment in time that we have a year of reflection. And I remember every day last March, day by day, what was transpiring. And so it is really kind of remarkable. I think across the country to think that, you know, we've had many different experiences that we never imagined we would have in an education setting. And we took many things for granted, obviously, in what schools provide. I can remember speaking to a newspaper reporter here in Nebraska about while we were closed down last spring for a full quarter, like many, well, probably almost everyone experienced. And I said, if all we did was provide the hundreds of thousands of meals we provide on a daily basis, and that's all schools did, wouldn't that be remarkable? And it was remarkable to think of how folks stepped up to address the urgent needs, and then figured out how we would address the concerns that we had around continuity of learning and where we would go. And Nebraska really started down a path, and I appreciate how the state board worked with me. I know last April, the board actually gave me broad discretion to start making decisions, because it was hard to gather a board up in the midst of things, to have meetings. And they gave me broad discretion to think about how we would interpret rules and regulations to address the challenges that schools had. And it's, I think, just critical decision after critical decision that even now, reflecting on that year, how important those things were. And I'm sure everyone had similar experiences. But we knew right away that the impacts of not being in school were going to be a challenge. And we saw the challenges with virtual learning. We saw the challenges with connectivity across rural places. We saw the challenges with connectivity in urban places where we just saw a challenge after challenge, just again, like everyone else. One of the things in reflection was thinking very early on about how we got back to school in Nebraska. We started thinking about what makes it safe and how do we do that. And I think it was as soon as May that we were beginning to build strategies about how we actually would return to school. Essentially not knowing what that would look like, whether in-person, hybrid, remote, and laid out several different things. In Nebraska, we put something together we called Launch Nebraska. It was launchne.com, where we started to lay out how we would get back, and started to continue to use that as a process that we tell schools, this is what we're hoping you might consider. These are things you might be able to do. I know by the summertime, we had laid out a framework where we talked about disruption and innovation. And so even as we were returning to school, we said we have to be innovative and we have to address those types of needs overall. But really, as I just did an interview yesterday, as it turns out, of talking about this last year. And if I really reflect of how much we didn't know that would be successful, and you had to take risks in the midst of this as well, at every level. I mean, and remarkably what schools could do. I will tell you our priority for what we message to schools, number one, figure out how to open safely. Number two, if that meant being remote, because that was the safest thing to do that, but figure out how to do that and do that well. Keep contact with your students. And engagement's a really difficult thing in a remote setting, especially when you aren't able to plan for it in such a fashion. So we said, find a way to keep contact with your students and families. And actually the provision of food in the midst of that was one great way that we saw many great examples across the state to be able to do that. And so there's just so many things that happened in that frame and time. As I watched the fall, most schools in Nebraska were actually able to return to at least some version of in-person. Some did, kind of the 50-50 split. Some were nearly 100%, but they had to institute a lot of different safety protocols and lay that out. And then our largest school district struggled the most to be able to figure out how to return to in-person. So Omaha Public Schools spent the first quarter in remote, and by the second quarter actually had returned. And we were excited that they were able to return to some in-person. And that's right when that national spike was hitting, and Nebraska was right in the midst of that. And we didn't know if that was going to work. We had school closures intermittently based on especially spread to teachers and staff that were critical to be able to run the schools. But we've been fortunate that those things have largely subsided, and now, including Omaha Public Schools, everyone is actually functioning at 100% in their schools on a regular basis. Now, I say 100% in the sense that the schools are open. We certainly have students and families that have chosen remote options as their schools have allowed that. And we know that there's impacts. We've actually continued some levels of assessment to understand where students are at. We know that students are impacted in the earliest years for literacy. We know that our students especially might be disconnected from, like, our career education opportunities weren't the same over the last year. And so thinking about students that were otherwise negatively impacted there is part of our theme. But we've really now laid out a framework for renewal and acceleration, understanding that we're going to have to understand all of these different processes and ensure that we continue to do that work to move us forward. So I'll stop there. I can't speak in earnest like Byron can, so I can only speak in Bloomstead, and sometimes that's a little long-winded, but I thank you for the opportunity to be with you, and I'll turn it back to you, Robert.
Really good sense of where you are in your state. And if you look at all 50 states and the territories, every single superintendent, every single chief and state board could give a different story. It's just not the same in every single state. And I think that's the important thing for us to remember as we have these conversations during our conference and other times, is that there is no one size fits all answer for this, because it is all about local context. And so thank you for sharing your local context. Byron, would like to hear now about the context in Indiana. What's your current state of play?
So it's interesting, as I was listening to Matt, how the bullet points as he has them are the same, but yet maybe different for us, as has been said. So I think that's an interesting point. And our NASBE membership would be disappointed if I did not do what I always do when I come on to one of these and tell you that it is day 367 of the pandemic now. So I keep track of that. I've been challenged on that. We've counted to make sure that I'm right, but we are on day 367 as we do this recording. So we have learned a lot in that 367 days. And I think for me, one of the themes that I continue to think about as we move forward is the idea that school is no longer just a place. And I've tried to tell myself that as we have continued and think about what that looks like for us to, because we can't just go back to what was normal. We've got to somehow catapult to a new and improved way of doing things. I think that's what we've really learned through this. And so really in Indiana, and I just pulled our most recent data, I'm very proud of our schools in the job that they've done at getting back to in-person. We are, as of March the 5th, 89.8% in person. 9.2% in some hybrid blended combination, and then 1% virtual. So that's where we are as of today. And I think that when we think about this chance to rethink what success looks like, and I hope that, and that's some of the conversations that we're having here in our state, is how do we know there's been a lot of money that's been dedicated, and rightly so, to our schools to help with our learning, our summer programs, all of those things that we've talked about. And I think this also gives us a chance to really step back and think about, how do we know what's been working? And I think that's an important piece for us to really think about when we look back to other things that have been done in our country. And when we look at the equity issue and so forth, I think we really need to take a hard look at how do we know what's been effective so that we can then move forward and duplicate those things. And so then I think the other thing that I'm most proud of, and something that I think is really, really important for us to contemplate and figure out, how do we continue? And I know this is going to be a priority for our state, is the idea that right now our teacher and family parent relationship, connections, partnership is at an all-time high. And I know for NASBE, we just had a great paper come out from one of my colleagues from Kentucky, Allison Sloan, who did an actual report on this and our relationship and parent engagement. And so I think that's going to be a priority for us moving forward in our state, is how do we continue that? Because we know that relationship and what I always call a partnership that we have with our families is so very important. And then I think another piece is this alignment between our schools and our workforce is really going to be critical as we move forward, because we know that we have students that we need to have ready and be ready with the outcomes necessary to be ready for the workforce. And so that means we're going to have to continue to work on our alignments and partnership with higher education, whether it's dual credit, dual enrollment, AP internships, apprenticeships, whatever kind of work-based programs. I think that's going to be another priority for us as we move forward as to how we really, again, catapult us into what the new normal will be for us moving forward. And then lastly, I would say that one of the things that really worked well in our state, and it was planned and not planned, because our legislature in last year's session had a bill that passed, became law, that was around flexibility for schools, around, when you have a school law book that's this big, one of the intents was, how can we make this more flexible for schools and have them come up with ways to be flexible, but yet still have the goal of our equity and excellence and really doing what's right for kids. And that was a partnership with the board, or what I'll call a partnership with the board, in that we approve those when they come through, and we've been getting many of those. I think now we have to focus on a lot of those were done around and thinking about our COVID situation and our shutdowns. And now I think we have to focus on, are there flexible things that we need to be doing that will help move us forward as we come out of this as well. So I think those are the big things from the perspective that we've been talking about in our state and from my perspective.
Thank you, Byron. There's some really great points to be made. And as you see, that while the two states that we've heard from, have distinctly different situations, they have some of the very same crucial issues with which to deal. And Carissa, do you want to talk just maybe a moment about how your organization is trying to help support this and things that we're doing at the federal level or at the national level, rather, to move this agenda along? Then I'll follow up with maybe some comments about what we're doing.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. And, as you know, some of this has been a part of a coalition of groups that support various places across the state. And so, NASBE's been an important part of that. I'll just say that back in March, after we realized this was not going to be a month-long thing, it was going to be longer than that. And we had been having a lot of conversations with chiefs. So I think it was like every other day we were on the call for whatever was changing. Because if you remember how much changed on a day-to-day basis, that the information flow and trying to get used to like nothing stays the same was kind of how we had started operating. In April, we released a framework called Restart and Recovery, which was everything we had heard from our state education leaders. And it was a vast span from everything from the meal issue that Matt mentioned, and about how we worked with USDA to make sure that we had the right levers in place, the pandemic EBTs that were available for students, and how you could actually send congregate meals out on buses and things like that, to cleaning and safety. At that point, it was a huge piece in that. The ventilation systems, virtual summer school state guidance, we put that out. The serving English language learners, and also there was a huge part on the social emotional needs of students, which all these things remain an issue, right? I think the meals are still remaining an issue, but you have to shift and think about how you do it in a different environment if you have 89% of your schools in person, but there still remains a huge need there. And then we released something shortly before summer called the Considerations for Teaching and Learning. And that was a moment in time for us to double down on utilizing high quality instructional materials to make sure that what we're using that was coupled with professional development was actually going to be utilized in that way. So if you think about a time when no time to be wasted, no time to like work on things that are not going to work, this was a moment we felt that was a really important time for to say, like, we know these things are high quality, we've got to put them out there. You know, Matt can talk about what he's done in his state to help amplify and use that among districts, but it was kind of a roadmap for all of those things and what needed to happen. It was part of what helped, I think, on the continuity of learning plans that many states then put together. Those things just constantly remain a part of our work. We have a whole thing we've stacked up inside the organization called rapid response, which is like 24/7. It's whatever happens to come up. You know, this week it's been the passage of the American Rescue Plan, and what that money means and where it goes and how it can be spent on top of the two other sets of money that can come forward. So those are just a few things going on. One other thing that I would mention is the digital learning gap. We had a whole set of work around that, working with private providers, getting how states were getting hotspots, getting better deals if they bought them at the state level so that the district could have those, or getting deals for the district, getting devices. Many states bought all the devices and sent them out to their students. Just an unending set of needs that we also realized that we have to all work together to do this. It can't just be done at one level. So this was state responsibility, but it could not have been enacted if the state board wasn't willing, like Matt said, to be able to give flexibility on the large set of rule books. And it wouldn't have happened without the teachers and the districts on the ground actually enacting those things. So those are just a few of the things that I think were big issues then and still remain in the ethos, and just in different ways.
Well, that mirrors exactly the thoughts that we have and have had at NASBE, because as you said, a year ago, we started what we call triage mode. We began triaging immediately all of these issues, and we instituted regular, as you said, almost daily conversations with our members about how do we triage the policy around this. We recognize that it really is the chief and the department, that's the how. They need to, this is what needs to be done. And our triage is now, let's help state boards to understand what policy changes may need to happen immediately to allow the chief to do this, or to give power for a chief to do this, or in some ways to prevent another entity from interfering or some way. So we were in the exact same mode, and we found the resources that you're talking about from your organization were extremely helpful, because it helped us guide us on what it was that we needed to do to get that done. And we're very much appreciative of the way that partnered together. And you also were talking about the need for funding or whatnot, and we of course actively work with the chiefs and with other organizations to advocate for that funding, and we're just really pleased with how that has worked out. And I think we all have celebrated a little bit this week about getting that last piece over the hump, and that can help us now not just talk about immediate survival, but long-term really recovery and rebuilding, that we can actually have some sustained growth and some sustained improvement beyond the pandemic. And you mentioned something there, Carissa, about chiefs and departments being concerned about the social emotional wellness of the students as well as educators in our system. We know that there's not been a household in this country that has gone unscathed in some way in terms of social emotional needs, some type of a trauma or whatnot related to this emotional toll that's been taken by the pandemic. So I'd like to hear a little bit both from Byron and from Matt about some ideas or your thoughts on how, now that school is becoming more either 100% in Matt's case in person, or Byron 80-some%, and we're all as a country moving toward that. What are some of your thoughts and some of your plans or some of the initiatives around meeting the social emotional needs? We've talked about the learning loss, we've talked about the academic needs, but even more important or equally important are those social emotional needs. So Byron, you want to take that first from Indiana, then we'll let Matt weigh in on that one.
You know, that is going to be one of those priorities that we have to look at. And I think for us, we've had discussions around how do we really look at our schools and know from a state board perspective at that high level that quality social emotional learning is happening in our schools, and we need to make sure that we're holding schools accountable for that, right? Because that's very, very important. And I think it's also very important for our schools to be looking at how do they hold themselves accountable for their teachers' social emotional learning, because we know that's another real issue right now as well with our teachers, because we know that having had to do online, and again, we know across the nation, we have people in all different areas of what percentage of their schools with that. But even if you're hybrid, we know that that's a great deal more work than just having a set of students in your room. So I think that's another very important piece. And those have been conversations that we've been having. What kind of assistance needs to go out to schools for that? And I know that our department has done some great trainings for our schools, both around the teacher well-being and that piece, as well as our students. And so I think that continues to be something that we're going to have to look at in terms of how we get that done, so that we know that that's done in every single case and for every single student along the way. Because as you so aptly put there, no one's gone without some kind of effect from this pandemic in some way, shape, or form. So it's at the top of what we're looking at, I guess, of our list of things. And that's something that we're going to have to continue to work on as we go forward with making sure that does happen.
Thank you, Byron. Matt?
Yeah, as Byron was talking, I mean, we just know of lots of impacts on our students and families. I hear this on a regular basis. In fact, a lot of our push in Nebraska to get to open schools was not, we had to balance the risks of those other things that might be happening with kids and families with, if we weren't in school, how would we best address them? And so as we keep finding what that balance has been, we also experienced a level of social and racial upheaval in the country in the meantime, about things that I never thought I would see in my life, that I thought were relegated to the videos from history, right? That we've experienced a lot of things, and there's a lot of need for dialogue and conversations that really are across our students and families and our communities. And then another part of this is really the well-being of our teachers and our staff in schools. And many of us have experienced it not just in our roles or our jobs, but as parents or as grandparents, or have experienced it with losing family members. And so we know that breadth of these challenges are real. We also know and knew right away, and I don't think Nebraska is unique in this, that one of the substantial places that we're reporting on neglect and abuse comes through schools, because we're aware of what might be happening for students. And so we saw a huge decrease in the reports that were coming in. Therefore, our social services and others, that we built great partnerships. I mean, I think this is one of the innovations that's not just about education, but in our role in the community to help one another has been important. Really, even in the midst of this, so we have legislation right now, as we're in the middle of our state legislative session, is to ensure that we're addressing multicultural education more effectively, make sure that we're addressing behavioral and mental health more effectively, making sure that we're thinking about community health and the engagement with our health districts and health partners in a lot of different ways. And so there's really many good things that I think come out of this, that we've exercised some muscles we didn't know we had, which makes us a little tired sometimes, but we're going to move forward and I think build on that. But I think I think we come out of a pandemic understanding our role and responsibility all the more in education, and for that I do make lemonade often, out of these. We don't grow a lot of lemons in Nebraska, but I guess none probably. But the reality is we spend a lot of time thinking about how we can make the best of it, and I think that's what the nature of education is, to reboot, retool, go forward, and make it better. And I think we're going to be able to do that on these fronts.
Yeah, I'll just jump in. I want to piggyback off of something that Robert said before he kicked it to you guys on this question. And that was, Byron, you talked about the things that the board chose to waive in a moment of crisis, right? And I think that the moment will be lost if we just let those things sunset and snap back, right? And so I'm curious if there are any particular policies or rules or regulations that either of your states have said, you know what, after we let it go for a year, we actually are going to have a more robust conversation about it. I mean, many of them were just like, stopped and they came back. And so you're going to have to go through a whole rulemaking process or whatever to do it. But I'm just wondering if there's something that comes to mind. I think of like, you talked about time and space, but like seat time, where you're learning, those kinds of things. Like we have really hard rules around some of those things. And I'd love to know what you think about that. Byron, I'll kick it to you.
Yeah, and I love talking about that because that's a place where we've done a lot of work, and that seat time piece is one of those places that is that we have flexibility in now. And I go back to that flexibility rule. Most things are on the, and I apologize, I don't have it right here next to me, but most things within our Title 20, which is our school law, it is on the table for a school to, if they have a way to make that more flexible, if you can come to us and say, this is the way we want our week to look and what we look like from a school day and time, then if that makes sense for helping students learn better, and from an equity standpoint and from an excellence standpoint, then we would certainly approve that. So that's on the table, and a lot of those things are on there. And then, Carissa, we were in, it's interesting how sometimes things just happen we say at the wrong time, but then sometimes they happen at the right time. We have been in the middle of really re-looking at a lot of our accountability pieces as well when the pandemic hit. And I think what we've learned, so I think this has driven some of this flexibility piece of this. So, the seat time, some of the trainings that we require, are there better ways to do that? All those things that we know take time, and particularly right now where we're really focused on how do we make up this learning loss are so important. But I think the thing that we've really now started to look at is how does accountability look so that we can be ready if something like this happens again? And I think in our state, one of the things that I'm very proud of is we've gone away from a state test being a requirement for graduation. We've gone to graduation requirements that have outcomes that are accountability aligned with that kind of a system, so that we're looking more at, again, outcomes and more at skills. And I would say this even into our younger grades, more at skills and competencies as opposed to courses. Because I think one of the things that we saw that in the spring, I would say that maybe we didn't do as well with was how we handled our graduation with our seniors, and whether they were in courses or what have you. And I think when you just are on a course system, you have no way of knowing whether you've got those skills or not. So I think that's where we're really trying to think through. And I don't want to speak for any of my board members. I know that's really where I am, but I think we're all having that discussion about how do we get the accountability to match more with the outcomes students need to be successful, so that if this happens again, we can measure those and know whether our students are ready. Because again, I think that's a concern I have is not only the learning loss, but also our students, are they ready for the next part of their life that our high school students that are graduating are going to have? But back to you, I just want to real quick, before I turn it to Matt, just say to your question of flexibility, in Indiana, literally with what our legislature did, most everything is on the table for a school to look at to offer flexibility. And then the partnership between the legislature and the board is that we analyze those and approve those, and analyze them under the, with the rubric of, will this improve student learning, and will this improve the way that we do student learning? I hope that answered, Carissa, but I think the pandemic just helped us really focus on that we do need this flexibility, and we do need schools to be thinking about this, and it gave them a chance to innovate and be disruptive, as was said earlier in the conversation.
You want me to hit on that? I will a little bit. The experience, again, very similar to what Byron's talking about. I think we also feel this need to, and have for some time, to really shift to competency models, especially between, I'll say middle school and through high school, and rethinking how that works. So we were actually working on some of that, and we didn't want to lose progress. In fact, the Nebraska State Board was working on revising our rule around accreditation, and actually we have a separate rule on approval for our non-public schools. And so we started rethinking it from approval, accreditation, and then accountability. And Byron's 100% right. It's time to rethink those things, because we lost data. We weren't a pandemic-proof system across the country for understanding how to gather data on students. And so there's still much of that work that needs to be done. But where we tried to provide flexibilities, I spoke very early and very often to our school leaders in press conferences and other things, and said, hey, look, we're going to be flexible. And I would say, don't worry about X, or don't worry about Y. And we have a process that allows schools to kind of tell us what they didn't hit at the end of a year and fill out an affidavit. And we say, you have our blessing, you're good, But what I found was that was really tough on people, because there were so many different questions about what they needed to get accomplished, how they would get that done. And one of the things that we had, the state board had given me authority to kind of start making those decisions in April. By May, I had a list of questions from schools that attorneys said, well, the commissioner can't make that decision, or can't, it said. So it was fascinating back and forth dialogue with school officials, because they were nervous about what they might not have. A funny one, or at least I think it's funny. Somebody was asking, well, do we have to run fire drills when we don't have school or students in the building? I'm like, I think you're probably going to be okay not to worry about your fire drill. But as you come back, don't forget, we could have other disasters that happen. And so we really looked at instructional time, and tried to grant that. I got very specific in this fall, because I did find that it helped us to give flexibilities, but with clarity around what we meant. And so we started issuing specific guidance, even though we had a thick book of what was going to be flexible. We started giving specific guidance to the kind of common questions that we might get, and then even highlighted those things and say, hey, look, this would be a good practice, and how you could exercise that flexibility. And I think that really helped. But what it's also told me is, educators by nature, schools by nature are creatures of rules and regulations, and there's a cultural shift that has to take place. So for me, just to say flexibility or innovation doesn't mean anything without examples of that. And I think as a country, that's what we're going to have to work on, to help come up with what those best practices are, with those opportunities for us to be able to provide that leadership from a state level. And I think that's one thing I feel like I'm learning in the midst of this. But truly, we put a lot of things on the table, just like Byron said. I mean, almost anything, and yet people have a hard time finding that flexibility if they don't want to find it. And we're still working on that. We have schools around graduation that are talking right now, because we're in the second year. We issued pretty clear guidance around graduation requirements last year. And we have to remember that our students are being impacted. This year's seniors have been impacted not just from last quarter or from last year at the end of the school year, but all throughout. And so there's actually, I'm finding some schools that are offering a little less flexibility to their students and not thinking as broadly. And so we're working with them on those things too now.
Really great points there. And I'm beginning to use a word that I never thought I would use when in terms of the education system or state boards, and that is we're becoming more nimble, because that is not a word that you typically equate with a governing body like a state board or Department of Education, that we're learning to be more nimble in making changes. And also working with a couple of state boards recently, I've used a term with them that they have discovered they have phantom policies. These are things that they always thought they had to do. They thought was required. I think there's a whole lot of phantom policies that we have discovered that are not really have tos or not really regulations. So that's good. And also I've had the opportunity recently to lead a couple of states in their strategic planning process. And I see an openness and a discussion of moving away from restrictive policy to enabling policy. That how can we have a policy that enables schools, that enables the chief and enables districts to do not what they do, and not such a restrictive of thou shalt or thou shalt not. So I am hopeful that we're exiting this in a better situation to have these discussions about how do we build back better, and that fast forwarding, this is a question I'm going to pose to all three of you, Carissa and Matt and Byron, that I'll answer myself, that let's fast forward 3 years from now, 5 years from now. What do you hope that the student experience is going to, how is it going to be different because of what we have learned? What is your hope that the innovation of this is going to occur? So let's kind of each take out our crystal ball and just tell us what you see there. Matt, let's start with you, then we'll go to Byron and then Carissa.
I was afraid I was going to have to be first. So yeah, no, it's a great question. One of the things as we've looked at it, there's, first of all, if you already have a vision or had a vision for what you wanted, it makes it a little bit easier to say, here are the opportunities that we can select from this moment in time that makes that possible now. And I feel like we've experienced a lot of that. In addition to obviously what's happening across schools, agencies had to go through a very different approach. And actually we went remote early on. And in the midst of this, by the way, I've always wanted to move to a different site because it hasn't served us very well. We're actually moving in the midst of this. We changed how we do data, remote work. We found that how we're going to be able to serve our schools all the better. We're going to be out in schools. It's been hard to be in schools right now, but our future of how we actually build out our platform to work and engage with schools is going to look very different. And so in 3 to 5 years, I think the Department of Education's function will be much more supportive of what's happening in schools instead of kind of, the ivory tower. And truly our building looks like an ivory tower. So we have that chance to do that differently. And I think that's exciting and should be exciting for state boards as well, I think. The other part is I do think our rule and reg process will look different. And Robert, I love your notion of phantom policies, because they exist all over the time. Well, you can't do this or you can't do this. And it's like, no, where does it tell you you can't? And so I do think shifting from a policy framework that says, here's what thou shalt do. Here's an opportunity for you to look at it differently. Just like the guidance I was talking about before was give guidance, but also give examples of how they can maneuver through that guidance. And I think we're going to make more user-friendly decisions in the future. And then what I would hope at the school level is what that results is in some of the freedom and flexibility to serve students all the more effectively, to think about how we've scaled up digital resources. I anticipate doing this in Nebraska. We're actually using some of the federal funds to be able to do that and think about how we scale up and demonstrate best practices with high quality instructional materials. And again, that's been a big part of our national conversations too. I also noticed in the national dialogue that where our staff and where our boards have been working together nationally, we changed the national dialogue. If you look at the language, it's about learning loss in the federal language on this, and we've shifted it to, hey, look, it's the fact that we know our students lost the opportunity to learn. And different states have maybe used different phrases, but we all felt the same thing. We shouldn't blame students for the lack of opportunity to learn. How do we shift that dialogue and start thinking about it? And I love the notion of acceleration, as the student's experience has to be know where they're at and let them accelerate their learning as appropriate. That's a belief I had long before a pandemic, but it feels like it's more possible to start working on that now. And so I think 3 to 5 years, it's going to take more work than I feel. It's not going to just happen without state leadership, in my view, because I think schools are more going to tend, and I've seen this in Nebraska, more going to tend to go back to what they thought normal was before. And I'm trying to encourage them to think about what the possible is now in these moments. And that's the dialogue that will change that. And I think we'll see better results, more individualized attention to students, a more pandemic-proof environment and disrupted environment that hopefully has some innovation in it as well. So I'll stop there. But it's a great question, and I don't know if my crystal ball is all that clear, but I think it's a great point.
You know, Matt, you really segued to me quite well when you ended there with the personalized piece, because to me, that's where my futuristic thinking goes back to what I led with at the very beginning of my comments, was school no longer being a place, and how do we provide opportunities for students for learning 24/7, 365, right? And I've said that for years. And having been a person involved in virtual education, hopefully we will continue now to have conversations about how do we make virtual a very viable opportunity for a lot of students. It is not for all students. We've said that. And that's where I think we have to think about what can we do that's good for all students? And I think when we do that, then we get some of our equity and excellence questions begin to be answered as well. And then I think for me, the other thing that I think at least the conversations in our state have started, and I can't speak for any others, and I'm literally sitting in our state house right now and just had some conversations with some state legislators about this, is I think we've got to really have some conversations about what's the right data moving forward and how are we using that data moving forward. And I go back to what we've talked about from accountability standpoint. I really want us to have some really deep conversations about what do we need to know about our children and what they're learning and the outcomes that they have. Because I think the thing that we lack, and so this is when I instead of looking in the crystal ball, I'm trying to paint the crystal ball, right? I want us to be able to tell a story with our data. And I think that's a piece that we lack in a lot of cases. I really believe that in our own state, when I, as a state board member, am looking at data that's presented, I can't always get it to tell a story. We have pieces and parts. And so I'm hoping that as we move forward out of this, that we are in a place where maybe we can even get to where we've been talking about a lot about policies and things. How can we eliminate some of the rulemaking to where things make so much sense that we're telling a story with our data that we can, as Robert says, nimbly, or what I would say agilely, make some changes to what's important to our state as we're going through. And I think that's where we've lacked some of that, but I think we've found with the pandemic that we have to be able to find the data that we need and be able to tell the story that we need and have that data really be reflecting and really be used in a proper way to help our students learn and their learning. That's my crystal ball.
I like how you said you were going to paint the crystal ball, and I was thinking about what you said, Robert, about 5 years. I think what I'm about to outline is, I hope it's 5 years, but I try to look a little further down the road. I'm going to start with the student experience, because I'll just say I have a middle schooler living in my house. I also have a college student that's back living in my house, but the middle school's student experience, like I've gotten to have that firsthand parent engagement that Byron talked about. I mean, I knew her teachers and I engaged with them, but not in the way that I do now. And some were great experiences. Some were because she was turning in blank things, but that's another story for another day. I would say the student experience for me is not put in a box. Like we have categories right now. In person, you're going to be a hybrid, you'll be in a personalized learning system. Like there's an array of opportunities for students. And I know my own student learns different things in different ways. So how she learns mathematics versus how she does reading could be two different modalities. And for us to think about that as a way to deliver, I think could be a really powerful way of thinking about it rather than the compartmentalizing that we often do for streamlining. The second thing is just to shed our preconceived notions. I'll talk about in a minute how we've had to do that in our organization and how I've had to challenge my own beliefs about, remote work, for example, that just setting those aside and finding out whether we're right or not. Back to Byron's point about like, what kind of data do we have that supports that? And it's not going to be the same for all kids. And we know that. I would also say prioritized versus additive. We are historic in education for continuing to add things. So an example of that would be when we released our conditions for teaching and learning, we released priority content. Because when you have to distill it down into a short period of time, you have to pick what is most important and what can you make sure that you get done so that you can move on. It also makes us go, wow, like we have a lot of stuff that we try to cover and we race to get it done. And is there an opportunity to talk about priority additive? And I think that's a challenge for state boards and for commissioners and state chiefs. Digitized access. We, as much as we're done with Zoom, as much as we're done with the being on cameras with people and we want to see people in person, it has opened doors that we should not shut when we're able to choose different modalities. Just keeping that open. I'll just say a bit about how we changed our work. We have been completely remote as an organization since, what was it, Byron, 367 days ago, completely remote. And I will be honest that as an organizational leader, we had a telework policy, but it was not completely full time because I had a preconceived notion that in order to get work done, you often had to be in person. And when you're forced not to be able to do that, you find new ways to do work. And we've had to digitize and use new ways of doing that. And we've not missed a beat. And so I was completely wrong about that. And we're actually altering some of our policies and admitting that, like being able to admit that we have to do things differently as organizations and for kids. So I'd say the last thing is just ultimately viewing all of this with an equity lens. Like, how does this work for all of our students? And thinking about each of the individual student needs. And so it goes back to my first point, which is like not putting things in boxes, but what's the array of options for students? So that's my hope.
Well, it seems as if all of our four crystal balls are tuned to the same channel, that we are all watching the same show here as it unfolds, because I could not agree more with the points that were made by Matt and by Byron and Carissa, and I won't repeat them because I'm just in complete agreement with them, but I would just extend to say that my crystal ball, in 3 to 5 years, I hope that we have learned a lot and we can look to the partnerships and the collaboration that we have built through this process. That often when we have our new member training in the summer, we bring all the new board members from across the country. One of the pieces of advice that we always give is make your friends before you need them. And I think that because of this pandemic, we now have much stronger relationships with other organizations, not just between the chiefs and state boards, but with the CDC, with health organizations, with all both at the state level and the national level. My crystal ball says in 3 to 5 years, I hope that there's a seamless relay of information that we can actually get together before a decision is made, and that we can have these partnerships continue. And I think that this is an example, as Byron knows, I often say that, let's make our friends before we need them. I think that we needed our friends the last year, and that we have done a good job, both at the national level. I think Carissa and her organization and our organization, we have modeled that throughout this whole year. There have been more coalition calls. There have been more agreement on what needs to happen. And I think we have an example of what can happen when we do that, because look at the advocacy that's been done with Congress and with the department, and how policy has been changed, how legislation has been changed. You know, we have proof now that that works. So my hope is that all four of our crystal balls are now merged into one, and this is kind of the beginning of the reinvention of our system, that we truly are focusing on a student-centered, individualized, and collaborative and community-led movement forward as a result of this. So with that, I think that we are distinctly out of time, but just like all conversations, I hope we can continue. I hope we can continue around the water cooler at some point, the Zoom water cooler. But I would just like to give each of you, if you have one thing that you think, I really wanted to get this into this conversation, but I didn't, we'll let you do so. If not, we will, we'll just thank each other and move on. Is there anyone that really feels that they didn't get a point in, they really wanted to share here in this conversation?
Robert, I just want to thank you and NASBE for the continued partnership with CCSSO and with our state chiefs. Just want to double down on your point about we're in this together, and we can't do this alone. And we have to keep our eye on the ball, which is focusing on kids. So thank you for your partnership, and thank you for having us here.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you. And thank you to Byron, and thank you to Matt for representing not just your own state, but your collaboratively for your leadership on our boards, because I'm sure Carissa is the same as I, that our board is essential to our operation, that we could not function appropriately without a very strong board that both gives us direction and gives us support. So with that, I'll just again say thank you. We look forward to continue this conversation in the future.